Let's go. Um, thanks for asking me to do this, and happy to share whatever thoughts are useful on teaching at a distance. For this session, partly because I don't know what different stages people are at with moving to or experience of distance teaching, we thought it would be better to do a kind of a bit of a, in some ways, quite a superficial overview, touching on a whole series of different issues, rather than trying to do any kind of detailed how-to type sessions. So rather than being how-to, it's more a kind of some of the things we need to think about when moving from a face-to-face situation to distance learning. And in kind of doing that, even doing that setup, it is one of the things which I'll come on to say is that distance education involves is making estimations of where you think the audience is at and what you might be able to offer. So we thought if I can kind of cover a whole range of bases as prompts of things to think about, then in the question and answer session, people can pick up on those bits that are most relevant, or bring up other things that I may not have raised. I'll make a few comments about some of the shorter and longer term issues that I think are facing us at the moment, before offering a few thoughts on what the differences distance education brings to us compared to face-to-face. I'll touch on some of the, in terms of kind of immediate problems of moving online, some of the things that need to be done, and some of the things that need to that might need to be addressed or thought about, and then go on to some slightly longer term considerations. I'm aware that a number of universities have already said that they plan to maintain a distance education provision beyond the immediate crisis, certainly into next year, and it may go on longer than that. So there's a need, as well as thinking about immediate concerns, to think about what, as we look to improve the quality of distance teaching, what sorts of things we need to bear in mind. If there's time, I'll touch on a few issues to do with student interaction, support and assessment, though I may skip over that a little bit, and then people can bring it up in discussion if necessary. And there's a few resources that I might direct your attention to as well at the end, though those can be circulated afterwards as well. So in terms of kind of short and long-term aims, clearly in the current crisis, a lot of people are being asked to make very quick moves from having planned face-to-face teaching to moving that online. And so one of the kind of issues that seems to be facing people at the moment is, how do you help over the next few weeks and months, how do you help your students complete in this year? And I think there's a need to be honest and pragmatic and think about what's doable in the short term for that, whilst maintaining some level of academic quality, and keep that to some extent distinct from what might be desirable in a kind of perfect world, or if you're given much longer to then develop or improve those distance learning materials over the medium and long term. And the other point which I'll make, and I'll try to come back to this a bit later on, is that for the medium to long term, if universities are serious about making provision for distance education, they need to take seriously, and the line managers and university management need to take seriously the workload implications of setting this up, and the needs for investment that is going to require for it to be done well. So if we think about what the key differences of distance teaching makes to start off with, I think one of the key things that comes excuse me, that comes to the fore when making a move from a face-to-face institution to a distance one is the loss of that immediate feedback from students, the kind of signals that you get when you're in a lecture theatre or in a seminar room, using that feedback, that visual feedback from students, or that personal contact that you have with students, that allows you to judge how much they're engaging with materials, how much they're understanding things, the difficulties they're getting. And the loss of that is one of the key things that affects how you think about and approaching distance education, because there's a need for putting things in place that can either preempt problems or provide mechanisms of feedback that aren't there in front of you in the room. To a large extent, I think that makes distance education more deliberately structured, and it's structured more upfront, because in many respects you'll be setting things in place for distance teaching that then can't easily be adjusted during the process in which students are studying a module or a qualification. So there are more fixed, or at least semi-fixed, set of learning materials that you're providing to students. And it's less fluid. You don't have that kind of ability to say adjust what you're doing in a lecture or just what your seminar is covering in response to immediate things that students are bringing up. There are some avenues through which that can happen, but they're more restricted, I think, at distance teaching. And it also means that I think you have to give more consideration to trying to prejudge what students will engage with in terms of the teaching you provide and their levels of understanding of the materials that you give. In a way, you can, I think it's fair to say, to some extent, you can get away with making guesses of what students' prior learning and understanding conceptual level is in face-to-face teaching that you can then address if you get it wrong. And it's harder to do that with distance teaching, and that has implications for how you think about module design, which is something I'll come back to later on. The other difference of distance education as well, and this is one of its real advantages in many ways, is that it allows much greater asynchronous learning. Although you might schedule activities for students online as you would in face-to-face teaching, you're likely going to be providing, say, the equivalent of lectures as well, in a way that students can engage with those in their own time. One of the advantages of that, particularly in the current period, is this sheer variability of student circumstances and the demands that they're facing outside of their study. There may be many who are stuck at home with nothing much else to do and can engage with study whenever they choose. But there will be others who have all sorts of other pressures on their time, and providing materials that can be studied at different times is a real advantage. But it also has implications for how you think about student interaction and discussion. And in that respect, I think it's also important to remember that students are not only at a distance from you as the teacher, but also at a distance from each other. And that kind of informal peer support, sharing of study resources, sharing of problems and difficulties that students can do quite easily in a face-to-face situation, have to be, there's a need to provide the facility for some of that at a distance in a way that's rather different from face-to-face tuition. And the other thing I'd flag up, and by all means raise other differences in the discussion, but the other thing I'd flag up in this regard is that the issues of accessibility and equality present themselves in slightly different ways and require slightly different solutions in distance education for students who may have a disability or have particular learning requirements. There's a need to think about how they manifest themselves when doing distance education as opposed to face-to-face. In terms of kind of delivering your teaching in the most immediate way, one, and here you can advise me or raise issues in the discussion more than me kind of guessing at the circumstances you're in. But although we've had some of this to do as well in the past few weeks. But one kind of obvious way to deliver what you need to deliver for the remainder of this year, even the start of next year, is to approach the provision of distance education materials in a way that mimics what you currently do. That is, you have some mechanism for delivering a lecture, recording a lecture and providing that online, some mechanism online for interaction between students and between you and students, and some forms of assessment that can be completed at a distance where particularly in the case where face-to-face assessments like exams or presentations and so on previously would have been used. And so in some senses, the immediate problem is how do you do those things and put it online? But I think it's also important to remember that the other aspects of what we provide to students at universities, the feedback and support, both individually and collectively, need to be thought about in an online environment. There's a need to think about how we can provide students access to the literature and the sources that we would expect them to draw on in their assignments and in their preparation for seminar discussions and so on, which is not easy to do. It's not easy to do that quickly, and often not easy to do that cheaply. And it's also important that either at university level or your faculty level or your department level, whichever is most appropriate, there is a means of communicating the changing requirements. And it's something at the OU, we've been grappling with over just the past couple of weeks. Ways of communicating changing requirements to students in a way that is clear and reassuring and helps reduce student anxiety in the weeks coming up, so they know what is being expected of them and what their choices and options might be. I'm not going to say much in this about specific tools and platforms that you might use for that, though I'm happy if people have questions about that to raise in the discussion for us to talk about that. But in one sense, because all universities use different kinds of platform or software to make things available online, it's a bit difficult to kind of make specific or very detailed comments on those. So it'll partly depend how you use tools, the online tools that are available. There's a whole array, and what you do with them will partly depend on what your university provides, but it will also depend on what your university allows. Mark was saying he's learning how to use Zoom. This is only about the third or fourth time I've used Zoom, partly because we're not allowed to use it on OU network stuff because of the university still has security concerns. And providing secure access to what you're doing, as well as a secure environment within which students can communicate with each other and with you, is an important choice to be made in terms of the kind of mechanisms of delivering online. And as I mentioned before, there's particular accessibility issues, and whether you tackle those by providing learning materials or interaction in alternative formats, or use some of the software tools that can enable access to different types of media. That's a whole area that needs to be addressed very seriously. Moving to kind of more longer term considerations and some of the things that might be thought about perhaps once the kind of this immediate sort of crisis situation abates somewhat, thinking about what needs to be discussed within institutions, within HE, as to online provision more generally. I'd make three suggestions for you to think about and come back if these aren't appropriate, or you think other things are more important or should be added to this list. But certainly I think some careful planning for distance provision of education is important, and whether that's purely distance provision or blended provision in terms of a combination of face-to-face and online, or whether you're providing distance equivalents to face-to-face teaching, whatever that kind of mix turns out to be for your department or your institution. Part of that discussion and planning needs to think about what is and isn't suitable for distance education. Not everything that you could do face-to-face will work online. Sometimes there are alternatives or equivalents that can achieve the same outcome. Other times it means thinking in a different way about how you approach a particular piece of teaching, particular skill or a particular idea or set of theoretical material or whatever that you might need to provide. As I mentioned at the start, it's really important that universities don't think this can be done on the fly, on the cheap, and on staff's workloads without any adjustment. To do distance teaching, to prepare distance teaching materials takes a lot of time. There was a blog on the BISA website from a colleague at Sussex who had been doing module design for a qualification there, and remarking how long it had taken them. At the OU, we can take up to 2 years to produce a module that is, say, 60 credits. So it's a big chunk of teaching, but it can take 2 years to produce that. There are quicker ways of doing it, for sure. But whatever kind of situation you're in, or how big a chunk of material we're talking about, it does take time, and it takes time up front. I think there's also a need for recognition that this requires staff, both in terms of numbers of staff, but also training, and that staff are provided with access to training materials. I'll mention a couple of free ones at the end, and there are quite a few available. But staff need to be provided with the time and the resources to get the training that they might need in doing distance education. And there's a need for, I won't repeat the point about accessibility, but that also requires investment. And the third suggestion I would make is to think very seriously about working in teams. And I know that in many institutions, team teaching is very well established, particularly on larger courses and first year undergraduate in particular, in terms of sharing out the teaching burden. But with distance education, I think it's also worth keeping in mind the value that is to be gained from working as teams in the design of modules. And I mean that down not just in terms of the overarching content, but in terms of a process of critical peer review of each other's draft materials, whether that's lectures or whether it's interactive online materials or whether it's ideas for structured student interaction. All of those areas benefit enormously from having other people have a look at them and provide comments and working in a team. And I think the other thing that can help deliver is a more familiar and uniform experience for the students. Some of the research that we've done at the OU suggests that if the kind of general format and the kinds of software is familiar to students, then that can help to reduce dropout rates, help increase engagement and participation. That you're not asking students to jump radically between things modules where they're being asked to do very different things and being asked to use very different kinds of software to engage. If we extend from those things then to think about what makes for good distance education material, what makes for a good module that works at a distance, and this is kind of things to aim at rather than things you will be able to establish very quickly and easily in many cases, and need to be given time. And achieving good quality distance materials is often not a one-shot process. It's a iterative process of some trial and error, some monitoring of what works and what doesn't work. But a few points I would flag up. Think very carefully, and this goes back to the point about having to kind of judge in advance what students will understand, what they will engage with. Think very carefully about how you scaffold from the ground up in terms of the knowledge of the subject, the conceptual understanding, theoretical knowledge, and the study skills that students might need in order for them then to engage with what might be more complex ideas or arguments at a higher level. So be kind of deliberate in that regard of thinking about what are the variety of different prior study that students might do, and building modules that remain kind of accessible and doable for students across that range. In ideal world, an aim, I think, for distance learning materials, arguably this is for any module or program of study, is to aim for the constructive alignment, as Biggs called it, of learning outcomes, the materials you ask students to learn from, and the assessments that we provide that allow you to see, you to judge how well students have reached those learning outcomes. And particularly in terms of the middle one of those, on the materials that you provide. And whilst this is the kind of the more desirable end, what's doable in the short term in terms of moving your teaching online is one thing, but in terms of what's desirable in the longer term, think very carefully about what kinds of materials, what kinds of assets that you're giving students, what the interactive activities, online materials, maybe AV materials, lectures and so on. What types of assets suit the kind of teaching that you're doing? Think very carefully about the length of things. We know from studies of how students engage that attention spans are often very reduced in an online environment, that sitting, listening to an hour, even an hour and a half, I believe, sometimes lecture online, is often a very unproductive way to provide materials for students. So you might need to think about fragmenting or chunking up your teaching into smaller amounts, not necessarily reducing the depth of what you're teaching, but thinking about how that can be segmented in a way that allows students to take on board one set of teaching, think about that, maybe engage in some kind of activity before moving on to the next. So the length, type, and the media choices are really important. Student interaction is possible online as well as it is in a seminar or tutorial, but often requires a more deliberate structuring on the part of the provider than perhaps you can get away with in face-to-face. And again, it depends partly on the tools that you use, the tools you use for that. But there are various options for how you can structure students' engagement with each other. I think one thing to bear in mind in that respect is also to think carefully about what can make for an accessible and attractive environment for students to engage with online. Many students vary very much in how comfortable they are engaging in an online environment. So thinking about ways that can be made accessible to students. And as I mentioned before, the provision of online libraries, literature, source material is also really important. You can't really get away with giving students a reading list of 10 monographs and expect them to have access to those if they don't have access to your library. And how you do that is a tricky one, whether it's through provision of ebooks. E-journals obviously are quite readily available these days. Ebooks are one alternative, but not a particularly ideal one. Other routes to provide that source material is to develop bespoke readers and that kind of thing. But there's a whole set of issues there to think about as well, I think. Just to finish off with, and I'll skip over this quite quickly. In terms of student interaction and providing support, both interaction amongst themselves and with you, and providing support for students, I think we need to be sensitive all the time about the very radically changing environments in which students are studying, and ways in which we can develop context and materials that help to reassure them in that changed environment, reassure them about about how they can continue their study, but also provide support, whether that's on a one-to-one basis, whether you're providing environments in which students can give peer support to each other, and in terms of the more kind of academically focused work, how we can provide group work tasks for students that work online, not in a way that can replicate a seminar situation necessarily, but perhaps address some of the same kind of, or deliver some of the same benefits of that to students. In that regard, in terms of an online environment, I think it's also important to establish and make students and staff aware of codes of conduct. We know from social media, we know from students interacting online in any case, that behaviour online can be very different, whether intentionally or not, and often it's just comments students make online or staff might make online to students, and not realising how that might be, the different ways that might be read or experienced at the other end, can lead to problems. So clarity of what those kind of rules of behaviour online are quite important, the more that kind of personal contact happens online. And in terms of assessment, I think again there's a kind of short-term doable situation. This is something we're grappling with in terms of replacing or cancelling some of the end of module assessments at the moment. How you can do that for the immediate examination period coming up in May, June, July, whilst assuring academic standards, but also making sure that we're clear to students in terms of communicating what's required of them. In terms of more desirable outcomes, it varies enormously among institutions how much this involves the shift away from the use of examinations, which both serve a purpose of confirming the identity of students, but also and address plagiarism concerns, but also in many cases deliver a certain kind of assessment as well. Moving from that to online alternatives is another set of issues to be considered. And just to finish off, and I won't go through these, but they can be provided or added to the BISA blog as necessary. I mentioned there are some distance learning courses on how to do distance teaching, if I can put it like that. And there's quite a few of these coming up or have been available. I'm just flagging two that we have some involvement with. One is on the Open University's Open Learn site, which is where we give our free to access courses, of which there's a whole stack. There is a module on moving your teaching online. Future Learn also has a module on that. BISA has been building up resources on online teaching, which looks really useful. A colleague at the OU, Martin Weller, is running drop-ins every Wednesday, sector drop-ins for discussing different aspects of teaching online, taking a different kind of theme for each week, and they're worth looking at as well. And there's a range of other things as well. I know the PSA are developing plans for further webinars, including some work from a colleague of mine, Donna Smith, and various other people from around the country. And Advanced HE have also been gradually providing webinars and online teaching. So there is some material out there. I don't think that takes away from the need for universities to provide training where necessary as well, but there are quite a lot of resources out there that might be worth taking a look at. I'm going to kind of stop there and we can move to Q&A, so I'll stop sharing hopefully, and Mark will come back. You're muted, Mark.
I'm not. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. That was a very insightful, informative half an hour. I think it's pretty clear listening to that moving online is not a small undertaking. all of us listening, I'm sure, have some experience of teaching online, but probably not at this, the scale that you do it at the OU, or what is increasingly now the expectation that other universities will do in the coming months. And you know, it's clear from what you were saying, it's a very serious proposition to do this well. It's not something that one can do through a series of shortcuts, or simply take, if you will, offline material and repurpose it without much thinking. It's a significant job, and you brought out some of the implications pedagogically, and also importantly the workload implications and resourcing implications as well. While I gather some raised hands, let me just ask one question to kick things off. Given, you know, your long experience of doing this, could you maybe pick out a couple of the positives? You know, as academics have to now labour in order to adjust to this, and maybe our students as well, I think, you know, we ought to be sending the message that this is not necessarily second best, imposed upon us by circumstances, and we're going to make the best of a bad job. Are there any obvious value added elements from online teaching which maybe you don't get in face-to-face, where actually the experience is a very positive one rather than you know, just making do?
Yeah, I think there are. I mentioned one, which is the asynchronous aspect. You know, I think that providing materials that students can study at their own pace, choose their time when they can, you know, watch a lecture or get down to doing whatever exercises are provided, is a really important
we seem to have lost Will momentarily.
Am I back?
Oh yes,
yep,
there you are.
I can hear you.
I am. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I think that asynchronous aspect is quite important. There are, I think it opens up, or it demands of us as educators, that we use seriously a range of different media that maybe when, you know, because we can get away with not doing that face to face, sometimes there's a reluctance to explore those as much as we can. One example that I'll mention from international relations module that we teach was thinking about how to teach theory to students, IR theory to students who may not have done much politics or even much social science study before, and thinking, well, of ways of doing that that might make it more accessible. And in the end, we used a series of bespoke interviews with IR theorists as a more kind of personable, accessible way into studying theory, but then you add to with written material as well. So I think, and you know, there are, depending on the software you have available, there are a whole range of online interactive tools that you can use, whether that's kind of instant polls or quizzes or computer marked assessments, whether they're formative or summative, and use all those that can both help you gauge levels of student understanding, but also allow students to gauge their own level of understanding of a concept or an idea or whatever. So I think that kind of range of media also is a kind of key advantage of distance education.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I've got two raised hands. Mariana, first, would you like to come in?
Sure. Hi, so I'm talking from Brazil, and I'm 34. I'm tenure track in a position where I teach geopolitics, majorly geopolitics at Brazil's National War College, and I'm the first civilian professor there. I'm the youngest woman, and I'm a woman. So there are these challenges, and I teach lots of policemen and army guys and also lots of students. And when I'm in the classroom, I can control how different their backgrounds are, and because I can see their eyes and I can see what they're keeping up with and what they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even talking about the ideological thing of like behind their backgrounds and how they judge me or whatever, but I'm talking about how much they're capable of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And because there is this thing that they're like, they're older guys who are willing to learn, like, and who are gonna learn, but there are those guys who are not gonna learn. And how do you cope with all these different backgrounds and willingness to go further in learning and to actually uh, keep up with the content and this difference within the classroom when it's online? Because when it's not online, you can actually kind of control it, and like you can actually act as a person who's gonna a trigger for their excitement. But when you're not, it's harder for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is one of the things I mentioned in terms of the differences of distance education, that immediate in front of you feedback, the feel you get for whether students are engaging or not, and being able to adjust to that does go. I think there are two things. One is in terms of module design, that you plan very carefully to make it accessible to students from a range of backgrounds. So starting at a level that may be too low for some of the students in that particular cohort, in which case they can skip over that material fairly quickly, but at least puts in place some of the building blocks, whether that's knowledge of the subject or study skills is often the bigger obstacle we find. It's not so much not knowing a social science subject area, but it's not having people, particularly people who might be coming back into education after a long absence, it's not having those study skills that you might expect from a standard undergraduate, and building those in, particularly at a foundation level or whatever, the first year undergraduate type level, if it's that level teaching at. Certainly in our programs of study, there's an enormous emphasis in that first year, level one, first year undergraduate, on building up a whole set of study skills that then equip students to engage with material in their own time later on. In terms of engagement, and I think that is, it's very difficult to do that, to pitch, say, the subject matter or the questions you're asking in a way that is going to appeal to everyone if you have a very diverse student body. So in some ways it's a question of often providing alternatives, if it's subject matter or case studies and so on, that allow students who are interested in different things to engage with those. Maybe even provision of choice. You can go down this route if you're particularly interested in, say, security aspects, go down this route. If you're interested in other questions that might arise. The other thing to use, I think, and this is kind of an area of practice I'm less, in many ways I'm more experienced in module design than on the kind of online teaching environment with a group of students. But the other thing is to use some of the platforms or bits of software available for interaction in a way that allows students to, you can replicate something like a seminar experience, and even have students split off into smaller groups to pursue particular tasks that you can then drop in on and find out how they're getting on before there's a kind of, coming back together in an online plenary session. where again you can pick up and develop or respond to areas that they found difficult. There are, there's a kind of variety of techniques that you can use in that respect, and some of it relates to design of modules, and some of it relates to using those interactive tools, or even even asynchronous tools like forums rather than synchronous chat rooms.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Mariana. I've got a hand up. It's from S. Martin. I'm not sure what the name is there.
Hi, I'm Susan Martin from King's College London. I wanted
Susan.
to this question about codes of conduct for online teaching, that strikes me as an area that's vitally important, and also one where it doesn't make sense for everybody to reinvent the wheel. So I don't know if any of those have been shared on the BISA blog, or if that's something that we could look at doing so that we don't have to duplicate that work.
Yeah, that's worth thinking about.
That's a good suggestion. I mean, talking as the BISA person in the room, Will did refer to some of the resources we've put up on the website, but there's clearly more we ought to be putting up. And the sharing of practice amongst our membership, and indeed reciprocally with the PSA, I think, that's clearly something that platforms such as this would be useful for. I'm just getting something on the chat. Hang on, just let me check what that is. No, okay. Have we got any other comments? I'm gonna put out a question to you all then, in light of what. Oh, actually, sorry, we've got Naomi. Naomi, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hi. Naomi Head from the University of Glasgow. Thanks, Will. That was really helpful. I was wondering if I could ask you to expand a little bit more on what does make for an attractive environment for students from a student perspective. Like, what looks attractive to them to be able to support the same kinds, well, not maybe the same kinds, but the kinds of conversations that we look for in seminars with students? Because like many others, I'm really struggling with this loss of what feels to me like a loss anyway of what we get in the classroom, of the energy, of the capacities to work with body language and all of the other kinds of markers that have already been mentioned. And I think I don't really know how to frame that kind of interaction in a way that looks attractive to students when it comes to doing it online. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can. As I mentioned before, it's not one of the areas I'm most kind of expert in. I should also say that the OU, even though it has always been a distance teaching institution, has always maintained some face-to-face events, and generally we describe our teaching as blended tuition in that it has face-to-face components, which are tutorial sessions or day schools. In the old days we used to have summer schools spread around the country. So we kind of, even in the OU, there's recognition that there is something there in face-to-face interaction that you do lose in distance teaching. I think the key ways that this work is the kind of that very immediate student-facing work is mainly done by the OU's associate lecturers, and some of the techniques that they use very well involve things like using one of the tools that we use is Adobe Connect, which allows something not totally dissimilar to this sort of forum, where there's a presenter, there's a group of students who are attending, and there is scope within that both for presentations and for open discussion, and using the kind of tools that you use here with someone putting their hand up to ask a question. You can set tasks for students to undertake and then report back. And I think so there's those kind of things that they are by their nature clunkier than sitting in a room talking to people. how difficult that is, how open students are in those situations, will partly depend, I think, on how, firstly, how comfortable they are online, but also it'll be affected by how well they know each other. And in a sense, if you have a group of students who know each other already from face-to-face, and then you're asking them to interact online, in some respects, that's an easier step to take than bringing a new group of students together, which many of us will be facing in the autumn, and trying to facilitate that kind of group interaction there. And I think things like the kind of using icebreakers and fairly non-challenging means of interaction and exercises up front helps to get students comfortable in that environment, as well as kind of then being comfortable interacting with each other on more academic topics as well.
Thank you. Ben Doherty, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and BISA, and thank you, William, for taking us through that. It's really interesting and useful. I'm at the University of Sheffield, and so far, along with colleagues, we've been delivering online teaching using Blackboard Collaborate. And anecdotally, out of 17 students, say on the books, about 11 attending a seminar, so more than half, which is good. My concern, and it's maybe one that all colleagues share, and it's been touched on in some of the answers, is I've doing a lot of master's teaching, which already had an international student cohort. It's not the issue about international students having returned overseas and the problems that creates with time zones, but it's international students who had limited English language confidence. And I know for a fact there's people just sitting quietly, their name appears on the Blackboard Collaborate, but they're not. And that's, I don't know if you've got an answer for that. I don't know if anyone does, but I wonder if you had any suggestions about how to engage international students who were already reticent in a physical seminar setting and felt overwhelmed by English language and interaction. And in many ways, this is perhaps their worst nightmare for them, because, you know, talking audibly and even typing. So just any reflections or comments you have on engaging international students in seminars online would be appreciated.
It's a bit out of my my area of experience, to be honest. I'm actually, although we're based in Milton Keynes, I'm actually just up the road from you. I'm in Sheffield as well, so I guess it depends in part how the kind of time resources you have available. If you have students who are kind of lurkers within a seminar situation, whether there's a case for following up with those students individually afterwards, in a way that they might be more prepared either to chat online or exchange emails or whatever it is, outside of a group setting before encouraging them to go back into that sort of seminar situation. I mean, to some extent, that problem arises in face-to-face situations anyway, in master's seminars or any level of seminars, that some students will come and not want to participate or not want to be particularly vocal. So I guess some of the other techniques that you'd use in a face-to-face seminar situation, of whatever it is, getting students to work in pairs online before one of them, perhaps who is more confident, reports back in a plenary, those sort of things, just to get some kind of interaction going, maybe things to think about.
I just wonder if anyone else has any views on that one. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and it's one we've all encountered in face-to-face teaching. I mean, I suppose the implication of what Ben is saying is the problem persists, but is different, and therefore different to handle in an online setting. Bringing somebody out of themselves in a physical setting, I suppose, going back to what Naomi was talking about, body language and cultivating interaction may be easier in a room than it is in an online setting. Anybody else had any ideas or experience of this sort of thing?
I actually do have.
Since I am a foreigner, yeah. I took part of my major abroad in the US, and back then I didn't speak English the way I do now. I didn't understand English the way I do now. What helped a lot was when professors supplied me with like the material before the class, so I could go through the material, and then when I could get to class, like even the PowerPoint presentation, I could then keep up better with that. So I think that that's an idea, and you engage the students in the classroom before it even starts. So I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got 3 people waiting to speak. Jonix, I think, is first, please.
Okay, thank you. This is very insightful. And my question is, we have one of the instructors who've had to all of a sudden move online. And with a situation, something that I've been gathering from the students is there's this feel that you're supposed to be aware that it's a tough time, and so be lenient. So you, as an instructor, you're trying to create rules and trying to, have assignments and deadlines of when those are due. But at the same time, you do realize there are students who are having a hard time transitioning. But then how do you draw the balance in such a way that, okay, you are aware that there are challenges, but then you're not just completely letting assignments be late just because it's a tough time. How do you, I don't want to say enforce, but just make sure that they are somehow trying to get things done in good time and not have the expectation that you understand that it's a difficult time?
It's a tricky one. In some respects, if you're thinking about award boards or results panels or whatever you have for at the end of a module, there will already be mechanisms for taking circumstances into account for individual students where they've submitted extenuating circumstances or special circumstances. The odd thing about this period, and we're working through this at the OU as well, is that whereas across the board there is a kind of there is across the board a special circumstances situation applying to everybody, the actual effect on individual students is very varied. And so we have some students who are complaining that where an assignment has been cancelled, are complaining that it's been cancelled, and other people saying this is a lifesaver because otherwise I wouldn't have completed. I think in an ideal situation, flexibility for students, allowing those that need to make choices, whether that's, I think some institutions are allowing assessment based on continuous assessment only. If that's an option, allowing that for students is one way of coping with the diversity. But I think given that some students may be in really extreme situations, there does have to be a kind of flexibility on the part of universities for accommodating that in one way or another, whether it's extending late submissions or extending resubmission criteria or all of those things in a way that is not, it's not jettisoning the requirements of study, but is being serious about understanding the crisis that some students may be in.
Thanks. I hope that's a helpful answer. Alvina, you have a question?
Yes, hi. I was wondering whether you could give us a kind of concrete example of how module design online is different from module design that would be delivered in like from face to face.
Okay.
Do you mind if I just come in? That's quite a big question. Alvin, do you mean in terms of the forms of assessment or the particular ways in which things are delivered?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm just, when you're designing a module, you have kind of, you give a lecture, you have 2, 3, 4 readings for a seminar. You give a kind of additional readings that students can read in case they choose a particular question and so on. So how would that be different? Say you have a week in IR theory on, I don't know, realism or, you know, liberalism and so on. We kind of know what we're doing in a normal seminar setting. So how would you do that differently online?
I'll speak to what I know, which is a level 3 IR module, where at a normal, at a face-to-face institution, this is partly a product of the OU's open access dimension as much as it is its distance learning dimension. So bear that in mind, that we might have students coming onto that module who've never studied IR before, yet at the end of that module, they should be at a level equivalent to the third year undergraduate. And it means that the start of that module is much more basic in many respects than you would expect at a third year undergraduate IR module, teaching realism and liberalism for the first time. We also build into that beginning of the module things like we have a study skills audit where students can go through a series of exercises to audit their own study skills and then provide kind of remedial tutorials for students to use where they feel that's necessary, whether that's on things like essay writing or time management or whatever. So it's that kind of making provision for students that may be coming with very different levels of prior study is an important component, not presuming they have achieved a certain understanding of the subject matter before they've even begun. So that's one. In terms of the things that you provide for students, I think this is where the kind of the breadth of possible choices that good distance teaching can give us, which I was mentioning before in response to Mark's question. I think that's one of the areas where you can expand your ideas on what you give to students, whether that's providing them with videos and then they online interactive quizzes or exercises to complete. You might be providing particular readings in whatever format, whether on screen or as PDFs, that they then have to respond to a series of questions about. There are various formats to use for replicating seminar discussion, as we were talking about. And it's a way of thinking through those for a module as a whole, and then doing it in a way that's kind of driven by thinking is our lecture on realism the best way to begin people in a distance learning situation on understanding realism, say? Or are there other media choices that you would take? And maybe you might come to a personal presentation like a lecture later on after they've done some other work beforehand. So it's thinking through those media choices, I think, I think if we do it well, that is a more deliberate and informed process when designing a module.
One thought from me, and prompted by what you've just said, online provision presumably allows for a greater opportunity for students to co-produce maybe their curriculum and indeed forms of assessment than would a traditional face-to-face type module. And that, coming back where we were 20 minutes ago about some of the positives here, I mean, does online teaching offer opportunities to empower students more, that rather than just handing them 8 questions to answer as a selection of essays, through online platforms you can actually have the co-production of curriculum and assessment and build student feedback in earlier too. You don't have to deliver a module lock, stock and barrel as designed over the summer in the autumn. It sort of generates its own life as it evolves in the giving, if you see what I mean, as the students feedback as the module is being delivered.
Yeah, I think there is scope for that. It's not something we do terribly well. The OU's good in in many respects, in that it's the production of distance learning materials is so institutionalized. There's all sorts of support that we have that you don't have at many face-to-face institutions. On the other hand, it makes it in some respects less agile, in that we create modules and they exist, and although we'll change them year to year, we don't often have that flexibility, that kind of lightness of foot that you could have, and particularly you could have with smaller numbers of students. I think it possibly gets difficult at bigger scales, but certainly with modules with a lower population, leaving empty space in your module, encouraging students to determine what the direction of that is, as long as you can, as long as you've got the capacity to respond quickly in filling those gaps, or allowing students to fill those gaps. I think there are opportunities there. Students will, in any case, share resources and share online resources if you provide just kind of standard forums for them to use. Say, hey, look, I found this video, it's really good explaining this. They do that anyway. So kind of building in that and encouraging that is another way. And it's another way of kind of increasing the diversity of the sources that students use, the diversity of voices that they have to engage with and experiences.
Okay, we are almost out of time. There are two people still waiting to speak. What I'll do is I'll take these two side by side, and then Will, if you want to offer some final thoughts. So it's from Soraya first, and then Gustav. Soraya?
Hello, this is Soraya Sanmazefe from University of Lincoln. Actually, there's been a quite big gap between that question that has been posed about international students and how they can be engaged more in the activities. I was going to comment on that, but it took quite a long time for me to come into the group. I kind of agree with Will in terms of replicating the seminars, face-to-face seminars in the virtual environment. I exactly did the same thing, and to be honest, my commenting on your question, how our experiences have been since the COVID, the switching on online teaching. My experience has been quite a positive one, actually. Partly maybe my institution did a quite swift transition. I don't want to make too many comments on that, but it was quite a positive one. We had quick trainings and we engaged ourselves. But my tactic, the key plan was to replicate exactly the same seminar activities in my online virtual classrooms, which I did. And I usually had, questions, key questions, and video, usually a visual element, creation of spider maps, and depending on the topic that we're discussing, I've got quite large groups of students. We're teaching quite large modules in IR. So it went really successful. I mean, again, I will probably say the same thing as William said, in terms of, the chatty students will be talking anyway. They will be participating into the discussions is exactly the same way as the quiet ones are going to stay quiet. But what my experience is that some of the quiet students actually started to talk more, and it became really a positive one. And also I quite like the breaking out the groups, and it was it's very flexible. The system that we use Collaborate Ultra, and we use the Teams as well. So it was quite a positive one. But with international students, I think exactly the same rules probably would apply in online, to my experience. I think you're probably the OU is better than the conventional universities. I studied, by the way, my undergraduate degree in the OU. So I'm familiar from the student's perspective. But I think the elements of face-to-face is really important, but with the distance learning, with the lack of obviously seeing faces of my students, has been a kind of a downfall in this environment. But some students commented, quite bravely, saying that I want to see your face, and we want video conversations, and obviously there are variations, and they're talking about, you know, we want to have our lecturer in front of us, and I did exactly the same one. I don't want to talk more, but I think yeah, if we replicate the same tactics of our seminars and lectures, I think it will work really well. Thank you.
Thanks, Soraya. Gustav, are you there? You got a...
Sure. Hi, I'm Gustav from the LSE. I just have, I guess, a quick question that sort of relates to some of what Soraya was just talking about, which is, and you commented on it briefly in your talk, which was very helpful, on the sort of the technical skills, the IT skills that are suddenly required of us if we want to, I guess, get some of the types of teaching that we enjoy, for example, active teaching, bottom up, interactive types of little games, activities in the classroom. If we want to bring these things online, sure, there are tools available, all sorts of tools, in fact, but I'm wondering a little bit to what extent, for example, at OU or in your own experience, what type of investment is required here of us to become experts in the types of tools that are available online, and then two, whether there's also a problem with high-tech and low-tech environments, both at uni, of course, but also for our students that may simply not either have the time or the tech that is required to access a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Well, if you could offer some thoughts on that, and then any wrap-up you wish to make.
Yeah. Really helpful comments from Soraya, and I think that those ideas and experiences are really good to hear. On Gustav's question, one of the benefits of being at the OU is there's an entire department, there's an entire section of the university that is set up to do the technical stuff. So we can be, in many respects, we could be complete idiots in IT, and there'll be people to help us realize ideas that we have, which isn't a terribly helpful response. I think from my understanding, face-to-face unis vary considerably in terms of how much support they already have for supporting what that kind of academic support role for creating distance teaching materials or online teaching materials. So I think people's circumstances will be different, and if that's in existence, then make use of it. If it isn't, it may be an area to ask for investment, rather than trying to train every academic to be an IT specialist. In many ways, it's more sensible to create some more generic expertise in use of tools. I think there's another point which is probably worth bearing in mind, certainly in the short term, and that's although it's not the most exciting aspect of moving to distance teaching, there may be a case for moving slowly towards the more complicated or sophisticated IT tools. Students will also vary considerably in their familiarity with different IT platforms. They'll have, particularly once you go beyond or into more rural areas of the UK or overseas, quality of broadband access may vary enormously. The OU was actually quite slow to move stuff online back in the 90s, early 2000s, partly because it was so conscious of the in effect the kind of digital divide that there was in the country and still is. So tools that aren't too broadband heavy, that are easy to use, that don't have lots of complicated functions. Certainly in the short term, there's an argument for trying to keep things simple where you can, because there's nothing worse than having a kind of synchronous online event and spending the first 15 minutes sorting out people's microphones and access and all that kind of thing. We've been just about blessed today with one tiny hitch, but you know, these things can go wrong, and it's frustrating for students as well as teachers. So there may be an argument for kind of moving slowly, getting students comfortable, getting yourselves comfortable before adopting some of the fancier stuff.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and particularly to Will. It's been a terrific hour and 15 minutes. Sorry, we've overrun a little, but I think it was worth doing so. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks again to Will. And a reminder, our next session is on the 29th of April, Decolonizing Politics Curricula, Pedagogy, Strategies and Reflections. And you can find details of that on the website. Will, please. Yes.
Just one final comment is, if people have ideas for things that, say, BISA or organisations like BISA and PSA could be thinking of providing that we aren't already, or that might be developed over time, then do channel those thoughts to, I'm not sure who, whether Chrissy would be the person to contact, or just BISA generally.
Yeah, in the first instance, probably Chrissy, whose email address is on the website somewhere or on the bottom of your Zoom invitation to this meeting. Yeah.
So just, you know, an idea of if there's things that we aren't providing that we could be, then, you know.
Yeah, and I've noticed from the Zoom group chat, there are a few links coming in and some suggestions about various things. So, as they say, let's keep the conversation going. Okay, well, great. Whatever you're doing with the rest of your day and evening, do enjoy. And thanks again, and hope to see you, some of you virtually at least, soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.